Hello, my name is Nell, and I have things to say. Did I let myself become disabled? Short answer, hell no. I would say it's because that doesn't happen, but sadly I know there are instances and examples where it does, where people's self-neglect leads to them losing mobility, losing functionality, and ending up living a life of disability. But often people who experience chronic illness who end up disabled are also accused, or it's assumed, that we let this happen to us. That there are times when we could have changed the direction of our paths, and we just didn't. But let me tell you, I became disabled slowly, and I was kicking and screaming the whole time. I fought it in every way I could. I didn't let anything happen. I think part of the problem lies in the fact that there can be people with chronic illnesses, the same diagnoses, with different outcomes. I have chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and multiple tick-borne illness. There are other people with those same conditions who aren't in a wheelchair, who are managing. And so people from the outside might look at that and think, well, they've got the same issue, but one is worse. That person mustn't have put the work in. The other person did put the work in, put the effort in to maintain themselves, but that person didn't. But the thing is, we can have the same source of an issue and have different outcomes. Imagine if somebody was in a wheelchair because of a car accident and you said, well, my friend was in a car accident and they only broke a leg and then they were out of that in 6 months. So you mustn't have been working hard enough. Same source, different outcomes. It's just nature. Things affect us differently. And the thing with chronic illness is that because it's so difficult to get diagnosed, for a lot of us, by the time we get diagnosed, all the things we could have done to help ourselves are no longer an option. I know for me, I started suspecting chronic fatigue syndrome in my teens. I was at the doctor's office for something unrelated, and I was reading through a magazine, and it had an article on chronic fatigue syndrome. And I thought, well, that's familiar. When we got into the appointment, I said to the doctor, hey, I've been reading about chronic fatigue syndrome. Could I have that? He looked at me and looked at my mother and said, she doesn't have that, don't worry about it. 6 years later, I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. When I was a child, I thought I had arthritis because I was talking to I heard somebody complaining to my mother about her arthritis, and I thought, hey, that sounds familiar. 10 years later, I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia. As a child, I had tick bites, a lot of tick bites. I got sick so often. I spent so much time off school, trying my hardest to stay well. And 15 years later, I got diagnosed with multiple tick-borne infections. By the time I knew anything about this, there wasn't a whole lot I could do. But the thing is, when my sharp decline began when I was 20, I was in and out of hospital for glandular fever and tonsillitis. The doctor told me to go home and rest for at least 6 months. I did that. I took my vitamins. I went to see the immunologist. I got diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. I followed his instructions to the letter. I came back to Newcastle and I tried to keep up with physical activity like the doctor had told me. I kept dancing. I kept walking. I kept doing my best. Slowly it was taken away from me. I think it was November of that year that I first got my first modeling gig. I did a modeling gig. It was amazing. Within a month or two, I was on a walking frame. I was constantly trying to keep my mobility. I wasn't lying around thinking, well, this is the end, this is it. I was working hard. 3 months after I was in that walking frame, 3 or 4 months, I was at hospital because I was suspected of having multiple sclerosis. That was cleared. I was put in a hospital bed and no one was there to help me get into my walking frame. So I was just put in a wheelchair and wheeled to the toilet because it was quicker than somebody watching me when I walked. By the time I got to rehabilitation hospital, my legs had begun to atrophy. And I was told, well, use them or lose them. You're here because you haven't been walking. I said, until I got to hospital, I was walking every day. I lived in my own flat and I had my walking frame and I walked around my flat every day, even when my feet dragged along the ground. I was walking every day. Then they put me in hospital, and because it was too much of a bother for somebody to keep an eye on me when I walked to make sure I didn't fall, they threw me in a wheelchair and then threw me back in the bed. And I atrophied. At rehabilitation hospital, I told them, I have chronic fatigue syndrome. You cannot push my body. We have to be gentle. And they said, yep, sure. You're going to be doing 6 hours of physiotherapy a day. I said, no, I can't do that. That is going to make me sick. They said, well, don't you want to get better? I do, but I've done the research. That's too much. So they would put me in the hydrotherapy pool for an hour every morning. And the guy in the hydrotherapy pool would say, don't worry, it won't hurt. It hurt. It hurt every part of me. And I would be exhausted. Then I'd be set up with the Wii Sports thing, and I would play golf and I would play bowling. My arms would get tired. And they told me I wasn't working hard enough. I was pushing my wheelchair down a corridor, and a nurse said to me, look at you, that's pathetic. A paraplegic could do better than you. Guess what, lady? I'm not a paraplegic. I have chronic fatigue syndrome. My entire body is breaking down. In the evenings, there was an agreement among the nurses, not me, that I had to use my walking frame to walk to my table, about 4 meters, no matter what I'd done during the day. I couldn't eat until I'd walked to my table. There was a pelican belt that they strapped around my waist. That's supposed to just steady a person. In this place, if I stumbled, they hiked me up on that pelican belt and just kept dragging me. Sometimes it would take 20 minutes for me to walk. My food would be cold. People would be staring at me. I would be crying. I'd have tear stains all over my walking frame because I was tired and I just wanted to eat. But no, I had to work. I wasn't working hard enough. With a degenerative illness, sometimes there is no such thing as working hard enough. There's no choice. What there is working too hard. There's something called post-exertional malaise. It's particularly linked to chronic fatigue syndrome and I think fibromyalgia. It's when the body is so exhausted after exertion that it just kind of stops. It can't cope. And with chronic illness, the level of exertion required for post-exertional malaise, the standards go very low. It doesn't take too much exertion to make that tipping point. So you have to be careful. You have to listen to your body. I was listening to my body, but no one was listening to me. I walked into hospital. I got wheeled out. I've continued to do physical therapy. I've continued to take all of my medications. I've continued to try. I've never let myself go. Sometimes all the trying in the world doesn't let you win. And if you live with a chronic illness, if you live with disability and people are pointing the fingers at you or anything you have done, point the finger back. We don't let ourselves get to this point. We would give anything to have been able to change that path, change that course. If I can look back and see a point where I could have done something differently, I would have. But there is no point in my past where I could have made a better decision, except to get out of that hospital sooner. As it was, my mother kind of broke me out of that hospital after I started having full body spasms and was threatening suicide. Then we got me out. But the thing is that there's not enough support, really. There's not enough understanding of chronic illness. So for a lot of us, we are given the wrong advice. And then we're told that it's our fault for doing the wrong thing. It's frustrating. I didn't let myself become like this, and no amount of work would have stopped it. And if you are living with illness or disability, just know that you are doing your best. And sometimes it's terrifying to know that you can do your best and still not win. That's just a reality sometimes. We don't always win. Alright, that's all from me. Bless.